Hi, everyone, and welcome to Katie Couric. Today I'm joined by best-selling author and journalist Malcolm Gladwell. On the heels of his 3 blockbuster books, The Tipping Point, Blink, and Outliers, he's released a collection of essays called What the Dog Saw, out in stores now. Malcolm Gladwell, nice to see you. Thanks for joining us. And I want to say a quick thank you to our sponsor, Dove, because without them, this wouldn't be possible. So tell me how things are going. You've got this new book of essays out, and it's doing gangbusters, too. What is the secret to your success, Malcolm? Everything you write turns to gold.
I have no idea.
Oh, come on.
I know I don't. If no one had ever bought any of my books, I would still have written exactly the same thing.
But it's much nicer writing bestsellers, isn't it?
Yes. But I can't tell you why they do well. I just write what I want to write, and then very happily, lots of people seem to agree with me.
Let's do a quick recap, because there are many people have read your book, but there are a few who haven't read your books. And if we had to kind of just sort of in a nutshell explain what each is about, let's start with The Tipping Point. By the way, New York Times bestseller for 271 weeks. Not too shabby.
No, it's not bad. Tipping Point is about using the idea of the epidemic to explain the spread of ideas and behavior in society. So it asks the question, are ideas and behavior contagious? And if so, how does that change the way we relate to the world and act and plan strategies and try and make the world a better place?
What exactly is the tipping point when you use that in the title?
It's a word that's used to describe the moment at which something explodes. Something changes shape, it's the moment of critical mass when everything changes all at once.
It's not the same as jumping the shark.
No, I don't think so.
Okay, all right, Blink, 113 weeks on the bestseller list.
Blink is about rapid cognition. It's about the kinds of decisions we make in the blink of an eye, and why they're important, why we use them far more than we think we do, and it's a kind of guide to when are they useful and when are they dangerous. So that's number 2.
And how it affects sort of all aspects of life, right? Not just in terms of your interpersonal relations or you never getting a second chance to make a first impression, but how it's not just sort of
it ends up talking about police shootings and the Diallo case and racism, and because after all, racism is a consequence of our snap decisions, right? It's not we don't sit and think and decide, I actually don't like Mexican people. People have a kind of instinctive prejudice that kind of rears up, and so it talks about politics. It talks about why are so many CEOs of Fortune 500 companies not just male and not just white, but tall, right? Why are they all tall? They're all tall. I actually surveyed them all. And I surveyed.
Warren Buffett's not tall.
No, well, he's not so this is these are appointed presidents of Fortune 500 publicly traded companies. So if you started your own company, I take you out. That's different. So this is people who are positions of leadership for which they have been chosen, right? And when we choose people to lead major corporations, we always choose men. We knew that. We always choose white men. We knew that. And what we may not have realized is that we almost always choose tall. They're all tall. I did 350. I surveyed 350 of these people, and the average height is like 6'2.5" or 6'3". It's like a basketball team, right? So anyway, I talk about why is that? That's weird, isn't it? I mean, there isn't some magic connection between being a tall white guy and being a good leader.
All right, I'll bite. Why is that?
It's because of it dates back to when we were all back in, hundreds of thousands of years ago.
We were hunters and gatherers.
Yes, and where you actually wanted the big, tall guy to be your leader because he had to see over the grass and smite the tiger with one blow of his club. It mattered back then. But then it no longer matters, but we haven't gotten rid of that kind of automatic, reflexive thing that we want. We want height, bigness in our leader.
Outliers is about very successful people, right?
Yeah. So that's the 3rd book.
Yeah. Would you like me to say the rest?
Why don't you?
56 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list.
Outliers is ask the question, where do successful people come from? Right? What do they have in common? And that book is very interested in moving us away from this notion that successful people are successful because of what they're like, who they are, their own intelligence, and tries to get people to think of success in terms of where someone is from, what their family was like, what their culture's like, what their generation is like, all the lucky breaks that happen in their life. And I want to kind of demystify successful people and say, look, successful people should be a little bit more humble about their success. And we should also
because
be a little...
they were positioned for it, is basically.
Yeah.
But you also talk about the 10,000 hour rule.
Yeah.
And in fact, someone tweeted us a question, and I wanted to get to this now because it fits in with our conversation. Mad Dog Martha, do you know her?
No.
Malcolm says it takes a village to be successful, but believes in the 10,000 hour rule. Or she says 10,000 years, but it's hours actually, to be a self-made woman or man. Why do you believe in that? And that's a part of Outliers, by the way.
Yeah, it's because there's been a lot of really fascinating work by psychologists in looking at where expertise comes from. And they've looked at a variety of difficult professions. So, they study concert pianists, classical composers, chess grandmasters, surgeons, all kinds of people who've had to master something really complex. And what you find in all of those cases, and everywhere we look, what you find is that no one reaches the top of those professions until they have put in at least 10,000 hours of practice. So 10,000 hours roughly translates to 10 years. You simply can't find a chess player who became an international grandmaster who hadn't played chess for 10 years. You can't find a classical musician who composed a truly world-class piece of music before 10 years of practice. It's just this extraordinary, it just says that we have to do things, complex things, for a lot longer than we think before we get good.
Repetition. You talk about the Beatles in this case, the fact that they weren't this overnight sensation, that they had many hard days, nights, getting to where they ultimately got to.
They spent years playing in a strip club in Hamburg, Germany, 8-hour sets 7 days a week for months at a stretch. I mean, the most extraordinary kind of apprenticeship.
And you also used, I think, didn't you use something about rice patties? It's been a while since I read Outliers.
Yes, I have a chapter in Outliers where I try and explain when we give math tests to people every 4 years, high school kids from around the world are given the same math test. And we figure out how do the 16-year-olds in Taiwan compare to the 16-year-olds in Minnesota? And what you find is every time we've given these tests, we've been doing it for decades now, we find that 4 countries are at the top: South Korea, Japan, Hong Kong, Taiwan, 5 countries, and Singapore, right? So I tried in one of the chapters in Outliers, try to figure out, why is that? What's so special about those 5 countries and by the way, they don't just do slightly better than our teenagers, they do way better. I mean, the difference is like this, it's astonishing. And I try and come up with a cultural explanation. And one of the ideas I throw out is that, look, these are all those countries, what they all have in common is that they are countries that came out of, that traditionally their economies were based on rice growing. And rice growing is this very fascinating kind of agriculture that's incredibly labor intensive. It rewards a kind of meticulous attention to detail and a kind of extraordinary level of hard work.
So you think of all those people who did that, as a result, many of these groups are genetically predispositioned?
Not genetically at all. It's entirely cultural.
So those kinds of things are encouraged and rewarded then?
And rewarded. These are cultures that are absolutely focused on the value of hard work. And they pass that on to their kids. And if you take that attitude of hard work and sort of meticulous preparation into the math classroom, you will do well, right? Math is about how hard you want to work. It's not this notion we have in this country, which is very pernicious, which says that math is something you're born with, is nonsense. Math is about, if you're willing to do the homework, you can master it.
Clearly I wasn't.
Well, you have other strengths, as my mother used to say.
Yeah. Thank you, Mrs. Gladwell, for that. And before we talk about what the dogs sell, I thought there was such an interesting section in Outliers about airline pilots.
Yes.
And when they seem to be more susceptible to making mistakes, to human error in the cockpit. Can you just quickly explain that?
Yeah, it turns out that an extraordinarily high number of plane crashes happen not because something goes wrong with the plane, not because of a mechanical malfunction. And not because a pilot is incompetent, but because there's a communication breakdown between the pilot and the captain and the co-pilot. They're not, when pilots in the cockpit do not communicate openly and honestly and freely, you have problems. And so what it says is, in cultures where it's difficult for a subordinate to speak openly to a superior, you will have more plane crashes.
Like in Asian cultures, right?
Yeah, so Asian countries, which are very, very hierarchical, where it really is, if you talk to anyone from Korea about this, it's fascinating, about how incredibly respectful people are of their elders, of people who are, higher up the ladder than they are. There's a really ingrained, which in 9 times out of 10 is a beautiful thing, but it's a problem in a cockpit where you need to have 2 people, equal people talking. And so I talk about that, how that has been a cause of plane crashes over the years, and how the airline industry, particularly in Asian countries, has come to terms with this and has specifically addressed that cultural shortcoming and trained people to overcome it. It's because I was very interested in Outliers in trying to get people to think about culture as being a real driving force in how good we are at what we do.
I know that you hate to be asked where you get your ideas, but you have said that this book, your latest book, What the Dog Saw, will explain it. It's a collection of essays. So how does it do that?
Well, I don't know if it does it explicitly. It may just raise more question marks. In the beginning, in the opening essay to What the Dog Saw, I try and kind of answer some of these questions, because I always get asked that question.
Yeah, I know.
And I think before people are going to read 20 of your essays from over the years on all manner of subjects, from pit bulls to Enron to Ron Popeil to what have you, they should get some sense of where I get my ideas. And the answer is I get them from everywhere. I have had to sort of train myself to think about everyone as interesting. Right?
Well, you're very intellectually curious, but I mean, do you see a piece in the New York Times and does it make you think, gosh, okay, this person did something unique. Why did they do it? How does this fit into the grand scheme of things? I mean, can you tell me a little bit about your thought process?
Well, I'll give you, here's an example. I was walking through the Chelsea market on the weekend. I run into...
This past weekend?
Yeah.
So we have like a new Malcolm Gladwell
This is a new Malcolm Gladwell idea.
Unfolding before our eyes. Very exciting.
This is just off the boat. I run into some guy named David, who's the husband of a friend of mine. We're chatting. He's an academic. He says, have you read this book you should really read this book by Irving Goffman, who's an old, brilliant sociologist from the 60s. I was like, really? And he gave me the name of the book. Yesterday I went to the library and I started reading this book and I was like, oh my goodness.
You went to the library?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Sat in the library and I started reading the book. And I was like, oh my goodness, this is fascinating. I mean, he was right. I mean, that's a beautiful example of a random encounter with an interesting person who occupies a world different from my own, who knows I'm sort of interested in wacky things and says, you've got to read this.
Well, what was interesting about the book?
It's all about, it's a guy who's really interested. Irving Goffman studied many things, but he was very interested in the way people communicate. And he wrote this essay, which I'd never read before, in the late 60s, in which he talked about communication entirely using examples from the world of espionage. So he'd read like 50 books on spies, and he pulled out all the coolest parts, and it sort of explained why it's so hard to understand, why it's so hard to be a spy, basically is what this thing's about. It's brilliant. Now, I have no idea how I'm going to use that stuff, but I know I'm going to use it one day.
Really?
I will so, in fact, I spent the rest of the weekend thinking about, now, how am I going to use that? And it may take me months to figure it out, but I will, because it's just so cool.
I know that some people say that you've become a brand.
Yeah.
And I imagine you don't really cotton to that idea.
No. I mean,
use an old
a brand,
Southern
that sounds
expression.
like, yeah, it's an odd thing to call a person. I mean, it makes me sound like I'm Cottonelle or something, you know.
But maybe Charmin.
Or Charmin.
I don't know. Yeah.
Something better. No, I don't think so. I mean, I'm just, I don't know. I'm just a writer who, and some people like what I write and like to read me, I guess.
But do you think you're good at synthesizing sort of complicated concepts? And I'm not saying your work I mean, I think it's eminently understandable and
Yeah.
relatable. And I think that's one reason why people gravitate to it. You know, it's not necessarily like the sociologist you described. And it's not highly academic. It's very accessible. Do you think?
No, it's supposed to be, because I'm not highly academic. I want to, in all of my stories, I'm really trying to explain the world for myself. And I think people I guess many people sort of share my point of reference on the world, or they're kind of, they seem to find what I find interesting. And I do very much, it is my goal, because not everyone in America has the leisure to go to the library on Sunday afternoon, right? And read obscure works of sociology. That's actually my job. So you know, I have this incredible opportunity to bring the books of the library and the weird thoughts of 60s sociologists to public view. That's kind of my little corner of the world, I suppose.
You also write about the stories you tell, and you say, quote, you don't start at the top if you want to find the story. You start in the middle, because it's the people in the middle who do the actual work in the world.
Yeah.
What middle people are you most interested in these days?
Well, I've been writing a lot about Wall Street, and at least I have a piece that's about to come out in the New Yorker. And so middle people, like the kinds of traders who were making the day-to-day decisions that got us all in trouble, though they're really interesting. We've been focused excessively on the CEOs in all of this Wall Street crisis. But you know, they didn't actually know, they couldn't have known what was going on a day-to-day basis. They have 10,000 people working for them, right? What you really want to know is, you know, if some bank made some disastrous series of trades that now, you know, ended up costing them billions of dollars, well, who's the person who made that trade? The actual guy who pushed the button, right? That's the person you want to meet, right?
But doesn't that person have to be empowered by someone else to do that?
Yes and no. I mean, sure, and you will end up, if you write about them, talking about that. But my point is, you can't tell the story without that person in the middle. And you have to kind of go, you've got to get below. There's a tendency sometimes in journalism, I think, and in trying to explain things, to go to the most important and senior person and stop there. And with my journalism, I always try to go well beyond that and get as close to the kind of day-to-day as I can.
Let me ask you a couple more tweet questions, or Twitter questions, but they are actually tweets. Free to be normal. I don't know why I'm telling you these handles, which I don't know, screen names. Does social media have a tipping point?
Yeah, I'm sure. We may have reached it, for all I know. It's really hard to tell with these kinds of new technologies because they're so new.
Do you
right?
use social media? Do you use
really.
Facebook and
No.
Twitter? And no?
My goal is to do less things online, not more. So,
Why?
Well, because I have a limited amount of time. And
Do you feel it clutters you?
yeah, I mean, my whole goal in the world is to clear big spaces of time to think and to explore and to follow my curiosity. And if I'm constantly on my BlackBerry, it kind of chews into what's important.
Having said that, are you curious about social media as a phenomenon? In other words,
Yeah.
might that be a topic of your book, of one of your books, because it seems tailor-made in some ways for you?
I mean, maybe. But I feel like lots and lots of people are thinking and writing about that. So I always try to avoid things where I think there are many smarter people who've gone ahead. Right? I never write about politics because I feel like politics is, that world is full of really, really brilliant people, and they don't need me.
Here's another question from Family Plaque. I think they need to go see their tennis. It's a very unappealing screen name. Sorry, Family Plaque. No offense. Maybe their last name's Plaque. In any
Now you've
event,
offended them, haven't you?
maybe it would be Family Tartar, you know? Okay, what was your favorite book to research and write?
It's like saying, which is your favorite child to have born and raised? I suspect it was my last one. Well, as you do them, the third one is the most fun because having done two, the first one was so scary, you'd never written a book before, right? And by the third one, you realize it's actually really fun. And you take, when I had a bunch of writing to do, I kind of got on a plane and went somewhere, went to Italy and hung out in Rome for 2 weeks, so I knew how to enjoy myself So I would say Outliers. And the people in Outliers, that I met so many fantastic people. That was just a riot. I loved writing that book.
This is sort of a variation on the question I asked you, but what's your process for honing your ideas? But then the person goes on to say, quiet thought, writing, debating.
Well, I have, there's a lot of thought, I have friends who I run things by, and it's very important to me that I verbalize something. So it has to be I'm very interested in telling stories, and telling stories, as you know, Katie, is not easy to tell a good story. And so I always try my stories out on my friends.
And see if they're interested or if they connect to them.
See what parts work for them. Or sometimes when I give speeches, if I'm working on a story, I'll just try it out and see what people, and you can tell. If you're talking to a room full of a couple hundred people and you're telling a story and at a certain point you realize that you've lost them, you've got to fix the story.
Yeah.
Right? So there's a lot of that interaction to kind of.
Here's another question from Christina Kapp. What do you consider the tipping point in Barack Obama's presidential campaign?
Oh dear, that's an interesting one.
I know you don't write about politics,
yeah, I don't
but
know
any
a lot
thoughts?
about. I suppose that don't know. There's been so many. He's had so many kind of. His rise is so extraordinary and so improbable. There are any number of kind of twists and turns along the way that that meant a great deal to him.
Is he an outlier?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I think he's a beautiful example of someone who. I mean, outlier simply means someone who lies outside of ordinary experience. Can you think of a person who lies more outside? I mean, what a story, right?
As we go into this next decade, the 2000 to 2010 has been called the decade from hell by Time magazine, and I just saw some Pew research that said just nobody had anything very good to say about this decade, obviously, starting practically with 9/11 and then the terrible economic crisis. African American elected to the highest office in the land, that of course is wonderful news in the eyes of most people. But what do you think is ahead for us? Because, or what are you encouraged by and discouraged by as you look to the next 10 years? I know that's kind of a broad question, but have at it.
I'm largely encouraged. You know, when there's a section in Outliers where I talk about this generation of Jewish men in New York City who grew up to become the leading lights of the legal industry, who took over the kind of legal profession in the 70s. And I talk about how much they all had in common. And one of the things they all had in common is that they grew up in the Depression. They were all born between 1932 and 1935. So they came of age first of all, in poverty in the Bronx and Brooklyn, in the middle of the worst economic crisis this country's ever seen. And what happened? What came out of that? Well, what came out of that was these extraordinary careers. And I could not help but wonder when I was doing that and talking to all these incredible men about and they're all men in this case, about their backgrounds, whether that had something to do with it, whether you don't learn something important and valuable and useful from growing up in difficult circumstances. Now, not impossible circumstances. So they did not grow up in the slums of Calcutta. They didn't starve to death. They got an education. They had parents who cared for them. They had all kinds of things going for them, but they did not have material plenty, and they did not grow up in a time of certainty. They grew up by the time they were adolescents, there was a war going on in Europe, and their kind were being slaughtered by Adolf Hitler. I mean, so an extraordinary amount of uncertainty, but out of that came a kind of strength and resilience and creativity that created this extraordinary boom that lasted from the 40s through, last year. And so when I think of this time, I think, well, when I think back to what came out of the Depression, why would I be pessimistic about now? Maybe we have an opportunity in these hard times to learn those same lessons. Maybe we got in trouble because we were so kind of complacent and happy that we never had a chance to learn those kinds of difficult lessons. So I feel like the children growing up today, one way of looking at it is that they have an advantage. They have an opportunity to learn something that no generation since the generation that grew up in the 30s have a chance to learn, and that is self-reliance and perseverance and a certain amount of toughness. Right? What's wrong with that?
You know, since you travel all over the world, and this will be my last question, but we hear so much about America on the decline, you know, and our inability to be competitive globally.
Yeah.
You know, with emerging economies and powers like China and India and even Brazil. From everything you've learned and all the observations you've made, what is required of this country to stay, or maybe you don't even believe it's threatened in its position, but to remain strong and remain sort of the world leader that it has been for so long?
I think what's required of us is humility. I think we have to continue to believe that we can learn from others, to be willing to learn from others. I think if we can, I think we had that humility once, and if we can recover it, we will thrive and succeed and persevere.
But don't you think that humility has to be balanced by sort of exuding a certain confidence?
Sure, but I think, you know, people who are humble are in many ways the
More
most confident. Yes, it takes an enormous amount of strength and security and confidence to be humble, to admit that you're not perfect, to be willing to learn from others. That is, you know, I don't think of those two things as being inconsistent at all. I just think we need to open our eyes to what's going on around us and be willing to say, here's a country that's doing something really wonderfully, we can learn from them. And here's another country who can learn from us, right? It's that spirit I'd like to see, that we instead of being so focused in our own backyard, to open our eyes to what's going on around us.
Well, Malcolm Gladwell, it's always fun to talk to you, author of, should I say all the names of your books again, sell a few more? The Tipping Point, Blink, Outliers, and Currently What the Dog Saw. And you're going to autograph my daughter's copy of Blink because she's reading it right now. Malcolm Gladwell, thanks very much. It's good to see you, and Happy New Year.
Thank you, Katie.
And now stay tuned for a message from our sponsor, Dove.